morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Suzy Jackson from our customer model team in North America from Accenture, and I'm joined today by Laura Dix from our UK practice. Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'd love to introduce myself briefly, Suzy, and it's great to be back at the next summit. As Suzy mentioned, my name is Laura Dix. I'm based here in very sunny London today in the UK, and I've spent most of my career focusing on how do we uplift and elevate HCP engagements in the pharma industry. Very excited to be at this presentation today. Back to you, Suzy.
Okay, fantastic. So for the avid attendees of the next summit, you may remember a few past references to a survey we did in 2020 for HCP preferences. We surveyed 720 HCPs last year to really understand how they were feeling about customer engagement and how pharma was engaging with them. We split our survey across 4 disciplines equally that you see here on the bottom left, and we covered 6 markets that you see on the bottom right. Now, what we've done is we've refreshed that this year for 2021. We've updated a few questions in line with developing customer models and frankly, in line with the ongoing COVID challenges we've all been facing. So what we wanted to do today was to talk through this refreshed data, bring you some new insights and hopefully some food for thought. So Laura, I'll pass back to you. If you could walk us through the key themes that jumped out of us from this research this year.
Absolutely, Suzy. I'd be delighted to. And, it's great to be coming back, almost a year later to talk about what expectations and needs have evolved since COVID. I think if I was to summarize in one sentence, the key findings that we have come across in this new research, we would say that a year after the height of the COVID pandemic, when we first surveyed during that very unpredictable first wave at 720 HCPs, pharma companies have continued to refine their relevance, but there is more to do. There is further to go. And those who do it well really do make a meaningful difference and are recognised and rewarded for it. So from the perspective of the first finding, pharma companies can do more to better understand the expectations and needs of HCPs during COVID-19. Secondly, though, those who do more are recognised and rewarded with more time, with more attention, with more engagement. Those who distinguish and differentiate the experience, those who cut through the clutter are being acknowledged, and that really does pay dividends, as we'll discover when Suzy dives into the details. And then moving on to key finding 3, there is a lot of commentary about this, but in terms of how HCPs are engaged, we note that they truly value connections that bring them the best blend of virtual and in person. And we're going to explore a little further in this presentation what we truly mean actually when we talk about hybrid and the significance of that. But then crucially, in terms of the what they're engaged on, there is an importance around focusing and a recognition that focusing on the needs of their patients and being patient-oriented and thoughtful in the content they deliver is really key. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take us, as Suzy is, through a tour of each of these findings. And we do so in a way that draws on data points that we found particularly interesting as we've consolidated this research. It's worth also noting, as Suzy highlighted, that this research is yet to formally be published. So you are actually the first audience who has the opportunity to listen to these findings and for us to share them with you today, which is a great privilege for us. So moving on to key finding number 1. Let's dive into this in a little more detail, and let's begin by reflecting on this observation. So pharma companies still have some way to go in terms of truly understanding HCP's changed expectations and needs well over a year after the COVID-19 pandemic changed everything. So diving further into this finding, I think we begin with a note of optimism. We note with positivity that the reinvention of relevance that we talked about back in 2020, when we first did another version of this survey, is beginning to resonate. If we look to the left-hand side of this slide, almost 9 in 10 of the HCPs that we surveyed are noting that pharma companies are adapting what they engage physicians on to meet their most pressing needs. They're shifting effectively, as we're going to revisit later, further away from more marketing, more promotional heavy content towards really how they adapt to become more of a care and solution partner. Now, this trend here on the left was particularly striking in China and Japan, where the numbers shot up to 98% and 95% respectively. Moving towards the right-hand side of this view, though, we note that the majority of HCPs believe that the content that they're receiving is now more relevant than before the pandemic, meaning, on the other hand, if you think about it, that there is also greater competition to cut through. Those who are leading are making waves. I think that's really important to note. I'll come into this in a moment. Actually, a third believe that content is far more relevant than before the COVID pandemic. So again, reasons to be confident and to be optimistic. And actually, for cardiologists, this shoots up to 46%. So great first note to see. There has been movement since 2020, and relevance is to a degree already on its journey towards being reinvented. However, we do still need to apply a note of caution. Now, when we conducted our 2020 HCP survey during the first wave of the pandemic, it was probably going to be unsurprising that as pharma companies reactively, rapidly adapted their customer engagement strategies amid this huge unknown, almost 6 in 10 in 2020 felt overwhelmed and overburdened by the amount of digital content they were receiving. But that was 2020. That was during this very unpredictable, tumultuous time. And I think what's really notable is that now that trend is even further magnified in 2021, well over a year after that initial wave of the pandemic disrupted healthcare systems and lives to such a great degree. We note here that almost 2/3 of the HCPs that we surveyed are feeling spammed, and actually 64% agreeing that the volume of digital communications they're receiving is too great. Notably, that number went up to almost 7 in 10 for oncologists. And it's not actually just a matter of digital spam or digital outreach. We also see that nearly 2/3 of HCPs agree that the volume of meetings that they're invited to join is way greater than they actually have the capacity to join. And they're acknowledging that they're communicating more often with reps than pre-COVID-19 still. So all in all, the majority are saying to us that actually the volume of engagement remains too great, and to an even larger extent than a year ago in many cases, which my view was when I first looked at this data, wow, that's quite interesting. So it's more really than ever, in my opinion, a critical time to cut through the clutter with distinguishing content and meaningful engagement. And to move on and to conclude these observations from key finding 1 before I move back to Suzy, I think it's worth noting, and perhaps unsurprising, that pharma's understanding of COVID-19's impact on the changing needs of HCPs and patients still remains a gap, even compared to a year ago. Now, we know that COVID-19 continues to drive changes in behaviour, attitudes and needs among HCPs and their patients. It's not reflected here in these slides, but to commentate on it a little, over 2/3 of HCPs say in 2021 that they still need more specific information about how to treat their patients and how to help their patients manage their conditions in light of COVID-19. And similar proportions value methods of self-administration and home treatment more than they did pre-COVID-19. However, pharma companies still aren't quite grasping the impact, the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on them, on HCPs and on their patients. A quarter, as you can see in this slide, believe that pharma companies don't understand them at all or insufficiently understand their changing needs. And you can see that among some therapy areas like oncology, this was especially pronounced. And to conclude this point and to revisit a question that we asked a year ago, over a year ago, when we did this research early to mid-2020, in terms of pharma companies' understanding of the impact of COVID on HCPs and on patients, we actually still note a relatively significant disconnect. Over 50% believing that pharma companies don't understand still the impact of COVID on them, and then 6 in 10 their patients. And actually the latter is increased even from 2020. So what I'm going to do now is actually conclude with a positive note. You know, it's interesting to see some of these disconnects, but as Suzy is going to come on to explain, as we move into key finding 2, those who do it well do receive the rewards. So Suzy, back over to you.
Thanks, Laura. So as Laura said, mine is a positive story for you. Key finding 2 is all positivity, you'll be pleased to know. So I spent my career working on technologies, processes, and strategies for field forces and generally customer engagement models. And what I've heard over the last year is a lot of negativity and concern about the return on investment and whether field forces are worth investing in anymore, whether this is an outdated medium, and whether everything should be fully digital. Well, I'm here to tell you today that the news is positive for the future of the field force for 3 reasons. The first, I'll start with availability of HCPs. Because of COVID and obviously a lot of other factors, patient numbers have stayed persistently low for HCPs this year. You can see that 3/4 of HCPs have seen that number decrease, and that is pretty consistent with what we saw a year ago. We're not seeing that shift as much as perhaps you would expect. And 61% admit that they have increased capacity and more time to consume perhaps new content, thinking about starting their patients on new therapy, and all the things that they can do with that time to be helpful to their practice in general. So a really key positive here I want everyone to take away. HCPs have more time. How can we use that time better? If we move on to the second slide, the second piece of good news is that HCPs are really starting to recognize companies who do this well, who engage with them well. 9 out of 10 HCPs admit that some companies do customer engagement better than others. And let's take a pause and look at that oncology number for a minute. 85% of oncologists say that some companies were significantly or moderately better than others at engaging with them. So we have 2/3 of the positive story here. HCPs have more capacity and they are recognizing when they are well engaged with a company. But still the key question here is, what does that mean for action? Does that mean they will actually increase how much time they spend with your company's sales reps and really, really meaningfully engage? And happily, if we move on to the next slide, the answer is yes. Almost 9 in 10 HCPs would double how often they met with a rep if their best interaction was repeated. That's an extraordinary thing to acknowledge. And that's the first time, I think, that we are really seeing an acknowledgement in the industry that there is a willingness to engage if the engagement is valuable. We spend so much time wondering whether, doctors are really even interested in engaging. We've finally got proof that that will happen if the engagement is valuable. It's not just about humans as well. You can see on this graph, 41% of HCPs will open emails and listen to other messages from companies that they like and feel value from. So in this way, we're starting to move beyond just personal promotion here. What can we do to build non-personal promotion, click rates, and engagement rates? On that note, incidentally, another thing we asked in this survey was about social media and engagement preferences. And 45% of HCPs said that physical and virtual conference attendance was their #1 preference for education. So going to a conference, however the medium, was a really, really key part of the experience for them and something they really enjoyed. And perhaps this is because, as we've seen, there's a sort of missing connection with your peers that's going on right now that we can capitalize on. And the final thing I'll say is that a staggering 75% of HCPs said that they are spending more time on social media now than before COVID. 75% of people. So it comes back to, thinking about where are our HCPs instead of trying to force them to where perhaps they're not. How can we meet them where they are? And we'll talk at the end about some perhaps tactical things we can do to try and seize that opportunity. So now I'm going to pass back to Laura to take us through our final finding.
Thanks very much, Suzy. And with that, I will move us on in our journey of these findings to key finding number 3. So to remind all of us what we were finding here, HCPs most value connections that blend the best of virtual and in-person, focused on the needs of their patients. So if we think about the what they're engaged on, plus the how they're engaged, how do those two things combine, and what represents the most relevant, quality, meaningful interaction? So first of all, let's consider the what in terms of what HCPs are engaged on, the substance of the interaction once pharma companies have captured their precious time and attention. And as we do that and we look towards the left-hand side of this view, one thing stands out immediately, at least in my opinion, and that is the role that patient-orientated, truly helpful, patient-centric content plays as an overall preference on the pieces of content that were most recently received that were regarded as the best. You can see here that a third valued pieces of content that they could pass on directly to their patients to help them. A further near 1 in 5 valued a piece of content that would help them with the administration, the paperwork associated with treating their patients. What perhaps is interesting on the other side of that pie chart, though, is the 8% that really value an interesting piece of promotional content. Although we do see many organisations making waves and really reframing and rethinking the relevance of their content, we all know that promotional content still features heavily among the materials and the substance of interactions. So if we consider also the factors that ultimately shape HCP treatment decisions, we also note the important role that data, such as clinical trial data, real-world evidence, plays as valuable content, valuable insight. So scoring in first place when asked what really helped them shape their treatment decisions, this came above discussions with pharma representatives and even KOLs. So there is also a question that we've drawn on before, but I feel is timely to revisit about how do you empower your field? How do you consider how you really pull through access to novel data as part of the engagement strategy? That to me is indeed an opportunity that can still very much be seized and would be valuable. So let's move on now to the what. We've thought of the how, We've thought about the what. How do we engage in an effective way? And we know that the industry commentary has been very, very focused on the future of the means of engagement between pharma and HCPs. We've noted the rapid rise over the past year of virtual engagement. And indeed, even over a year ago, when we first asked the question, it was perhaps no surprise that there was almost a complete turnaround before COVID-19 in-person meetings, quite predictably dominating, and then in the height of the pandemic at the middle of last year, a real switch over 65 to 35 respectively. One thing I consider really interesting is that notwithstanding the fact that many travel restrictions have now been eased and there is more mobility than perhaps there was in those more restricted, those more locked down times, we're not seeing a really quick return or any return perhaps to the in-person meeting volume that we saw pre-COVID-19. You can see here that in mid-2021, the focus really for HCPs is they like to be engaged. 61% in virtual meetings had been engaged and 39% in in-person meetings. And I think if we go future-facing and we think about what is the preference for after the COVID pandemic ends, appreciating now it's been ongoing for some time, perhaps it's no surprise at all that the majority of people value an in-person and virtual hybrid way of engaging, but a not insignificant number as well value the idea of all meetings being virtual. You can see here 38% appreciating and valuing virtual-only connection. I think what's very interesting here, though, is that small 4%, that 4% in the grey in the pie chart that say that they value no meetings at all, they prefer not to engage. Turning that around, it still indicates to us that 96% of the HCPs that we surveyed still value some form of engagement. And that's really important as we consider the evolving role of the rep. So to move on and perhaps to start to draw some conclusions here, we looked long and hard at the data that we received, and we made sure in that data or in that survey to really focus down on what are the ingredients of a quality experience. We asked loads of questions and we gave loads of options. Is it about pace, rapid responsiveness? Is it about the human connection, understanding and empathy? Is it about the ability to provide information that serves my most pressing needs? And what was really interesting, notwithstanding some of the practice area variations I'll talk about in a moment, was that there was a lot that got selected and actually little means of distinguishing between the most popular methods of engagement and ingredients to relevance across the whole population of HCPs that we surveyed. And that in itself is quite an interesting observation. There is no one single concoction for what relevance really means, but there are characteristics of it that can resonate by the person, and in this case, actually, by the specialty as well. So noting this and just navigating through these observations, the most popular trait of a great engagement by general practitioners was knowing when in my schedule you could reach me, the practicality of actually scheduling and arranging time and not bombarding at undesirable times. For an oncologist, they most valued opportunities to collaborate with their network and their peers. What role can pharma play in compliantly brokering those connections? For immunologists, the most preferred approach was a rapid response. I want you to come to me quickly. I have a need. Come back to me with an answer. I don't want to waste any time, and I'm looking to you, pharma, to do that in a really efficient way. And then for cardiologists, the number one dimension of a great experience was how you interact with me in a human way, the empathy, the authenticity, that personalization of interaction. So now we're going to pivot to some conclusions, and I'm going to move on to maybe Suzy, go back to you to summarize, and we'll have a little discussion about this, I think, what we note as the main takeaways of this research.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Laura. So the first one is the relevance point that Laura was just making. We need to continuously challenge what this relevance looks like. And I will note now, and I will note it as many times as required, perhaps it's not just about, I heard someone say this earlier today, it's not about the shiny widget, the new tool that you can screw in. It is about just doing engagements really, really well. New selling models, perhaps, new training for your people, making sure that they're prepared to have really, really well-defined conversations. And we can talk more about some tactical things in a second there. The second is the field force as a standalone channel. Gone are the days that would be the only interaction that an HCP would have with a company. So we need to really start thinking about that tapestry of interactions that an HCP has with a company and how do they relate to the company as a whole. And then thirdly, minimizing the content clutter. Our research shows that companies are still not getting this right. And this is a really key part of research. Less is more here. So Laura, I want to close and spend the last 5 minutes talking about tactics. So if you had to recommend one or two tactical things that you could do to continuously challenge that relevance and redefine it on an ongoing basis, what would you suggest?
I think there are two truths, Suzy, that we need to acknowledge up front on this relevance question. I think, firstly, one of accountability. No single team owns creating relevance. It's the product of this strategic, this enduring partnership across customer-facing functions. Secondly, relevance is far from static in today's unpredictable world, and there is a need to continually challenge our orthodoxies on what defines relevance and keep up with that pace. So I think forging a really structured, ongoing approach to capturing the HCP pulse with really clear accountabilities across and within teams is super essential for success. success. And I think too often this can become embedded in siloed teams. Perhaps one team is capturing a customer pulse somewhere, somebody else is doing some insight, but does it truly cohesively come together across the organization? Is there the right governance in place to keep it high on the agenda? Are the right accountabilities in place? And I think also it's not just a question of that. There's also, how do you close your loop on the insight that you get? What do you do with that insight, even if you get it in a really coordinated, highly visible way? And I think actually those who do create the best experiences are those who are not only the ones who continually challenge themselves on what relevance means, continually capture that pulse, powered by this proactive research approach, but they're also really nimble actually in harnessing what those insights are telling them to evolve the engagements they create, and actually the capabilities, the human capabilities and the digital capabilities that fuel them.
Perfect. Yeah, I love that. And I think as we think about Field Force as a standalone channel, I feel the same. I feel like there's a really, really fascinating opportunity here that we can look at interactions as a holistic and do our research on that holistic level. You know, I'm starting to talk about social media, social listening, TikTok, Clubhouse, all of these really, really cool new ways of interacting and how we research across those channels. And secondly, how companies can be an orchestrator of really cool experiences. You know, again, we're not just going to do that face-to-face discussion. We can think about, you know, can we run seminars or discussion groups, connect peers, and really sponsor some of that connectivity. So I'm really, really excited for the future of some of this stuff. And as I called it before, I keep calling it a tapestry. You can't just look at silos, as you said. You know, there's a tapestry here that can really be woven through. So in the last 1 minute, how would you think for content clutter, how would you recommend that we cut some of that down?
Well, it really surprised me, Suzy, to see that this concept of spam was still just so pertinent in 2021 as well as 2020. And I think, you know, acknowledging we're running out of time slightly, I suppose my summary would be really challenge yourselves, or organizations should challenge themselves on, is this content helpful to us, or is it helpful to the HCP? And actually, if the big message that we're getting is helping me help my patients, moving more away from the promotional side, acknowledging there will always be an element of promotion, but also that the longer term return on investment can be built up through trust. You know, thinking about what education, what easy to curate content can be given for patients, and doing that really holistically across and above brands, to me, Suzy, is absolutely the direction that should be focused in on. You know, especially since we're still seeing, you know, this message come through from HCPs that they feel overburdened.
I love that. So I'm hearing less is more, connectivity, move away from those silos and really research in new ways that we haven't done before. So we hope if you only take one thing away, it's a really great time to invest in developing truly great experiences for HCPs, blending virtual and hybrid. Thank you so much. You are the first people we've shared this research with. So we hope you enjoyed our debut. Please reach out anytime and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're always here for any questions. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.